Monster Hunter has finally arrived on Nintendo Switch with Monster Hunter Rise, and in many ways this marks a special occasion for both the series and the Switch hardware. For starters, this is the first wide-open 3D experience built using Capcom's RE engine for Nintendo Switch. It showcases what's possible with the engine on more limited hardware, delivering much of what pushed the series forward in Monster Hunter World amazingly. It also represents a curious combination that marries elements the series was known for on portable machines with quality of life improvements featured in the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One game. So how does it run in its final form? Is the Switch really up to the task here? How has it changed visually moving to the RE engine? And how does it stack up against Monster Hunter World? These are the questions I'm interested in answering today, so let's get into it. To understand its place in history, we must first consider where the game comes from. Monster Hunter got its start on PlayStation 2, and this original title helped define the game as we would come to know it. The basic world structure of a village with different environments to explore, all divided up by loading screens, was founded here. But this somewhat segmented approach, which was not unusual for the era, allowed the developers to deliver these beautiful vistas. The game world itself is not wide open, but it feels like it is, and in some ways that is most critical to building atmosphere. But it was the game design and the focus on taking down large monsters over a lengthy period of time that was perhaps so unique for its day. Beyond that, it was also one of the few PlayStation 2 titles designed around cooperative network play. Perhaps it was just a little too ambitious for the era though. Now, it did receive a sequel, but really, it was the release on PlayStation Portable that helped define the series. With multiple installments for PSP, Monster Hunter became a perfect local multiplayer game with users linking together PSP systems and playing together. It wasn't hugely successful in the US, I suppose, though still reasonably so, but it was a smash hit in Japan and arguably one of the games that saved that platform in its home territory. Yet even with this success and initial plans to bring the series to PlayStation 3, it instead made the jump to Nintendo systems, including the Wii, Wii U, and 3DS. These games all retain the segmented design, and this is perhaps an important thing to remember when discussing the evolution of the series as a whole. You see, up through the 3DS games, the design of Monster Hunter games revolved around the concept of these split maps. Essentially, each larger area was broken up into a series of smaller, numbered maps. You would do battle with monsters in each of these areas, but they could move around the larger map where you could then follow them through the loading zones. It worked, but always kind of felt like there was a limitation in place, no doubt due to the target hardware. Which is why the arrival of Monster Hunter World represented a shift in design. By aiming for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the PC, Capcom could both build a more ambitious game, but also refine it to target Western audience as well as the original Japanese fans. One of the biggest changes is this removal of the segmented world design. Instead, you have a single, mostly seamless world. Yes, villages are still divided out, but once you enter each hunting area, it was wide open for exploration without loading. Which is why I was curious about Monster Hunter Rise. Would they return to the segmented design due to the slightly less capable hardware, or would they find a way to push forward with the more seamless world? Well, thankfully, it's the latter approach that has been taken here. Monster Hunter Rise features the same large open areas devoid of loading screens as we saw in Monster Hunter World. What's interesting here though is that the game was developed using the RE engine as noted earlier, while Monster Hunter World, which was clearly never designed to be ported to Switch, was based around Capcom's MT framework. So what does this mean for Monster Hunter Rise then? Well, aside from the more seamless design which has persisted here in this new game, Monster Hunter Rise looks great, especially given the platform. The environments themselves are huge, and the new wirebug mechanic allows you to traverse more of the map than any prior installment. You can now reach areas that almost seem as if they should not be accessible, which makes for a more enjoyable traversal experience. The overall level of detail remains lower than Monster Hunter World, of course, and that's expected. And you'll certainly note the flat textured surface look in many areas due to limited foliage usage, but it works really well overall. The smaller village area is certainly one of the highlights though, with gorgeous use of distant scenery to lend what is a simple gameplay hub a beautiful aesthetic. The lighting, the colors, the shadows, everything here is just brilliant. Of course, even still, it's clear that many of the visual features that the RE engine is capable of are not fully utilized here, but that doesn't mean you won't find some of them. Bokeh depth of field, for instance, is used beautifully during numerous cutscenes in the game. Now, when it comes to image quality, things are rather interesting. It's common for modern day games to utilize techniques such as temporal anti-aliasing to really clean up motion and minimize shimmering. The problem is, when you couple TAA techniques with low rendering resolution, you end up with something rather blurry or smeary. This is a persistent problem with a number of Switch games I've found over the years. But Monster Hunter Rise takes a different approach and has a somewhat more raw appearance compared to many Switch titles. I suppose it's more in line with games that Nintendo itself produces, and I think it's probably the right choice here. There is more shimmering to be sure, but it looks sharper overall. But what is the actual resolution then? Well, in docked mode, pixel counts suggest a fixed resolution of 1344 by 756, with edges producing a regular sample count with 21 out of 30 pixels. Due to the nature of the image, this game is much easier to pixel count than your typical modern game release. Portable mode then drops this to 960 by 540, which is ever so slightly below the native resolution of the PS Vita screen, it should be noted. So when it comes to image quality, I think Capcom has made the right choice here. So, it's a nice looking game then. It's not mind-blowing necessarily, but it's beautifully crafted for the target platform. But at this point, I'd like to shift over to something a little different and discuss the animation. Since the beginning of the series, Monster Hunter has always focused on animation priority. That is, when you spin up an attack, it takes time for the attack animation to play out. You have to commit. It requires careful timing in the larger battles to avoid taking damage, but also makes for a game that some might describe as a little sluggish. The thing is, while I appreciate this design, something has always felt slightly off about certain animations in this game, specifically the basic locomotion. Now, this is the basic run animation in Monster Hunter Rise. It looks pretty good. The character bobs up and down with each step, suggesting that there's weight to their equipment. But it's the connection to the terrain that feels a little off. While animation is adjusted based on slope, it doesn't collide with various object meshes placed along the terrain, which means when walking up a slope like this, you can see the feet clip through the terrain. When you couple this with the lack of footprints, you have this weird mix of heavy looking animation that doesn't really seem to impact the environment like it should. This is one area where Monster Hunter World has an advantage. Look closely at the foot placement here. It more accurately matches the terrain, while clipping with the stones is minimized. The character simply has a stronger connection to the ground. There's also an extra sense of weight in the basic walking animation in World thanks to the additional bits and bobs dangling around on the character model. Thankfully, the rest of the animation work is familiar and solid. The attack animation, for instance, seems to be directly based on Monster Hunter World, as you can see. They line up perfectly. I did notice this nice touch in World though. When your weapon is swung near a palico, the palico reacts. In Monster Hunter Rise, there's no additional animation to reflect this. It's a minor thing, sure, but it demonstrates some of the smaller things that have been tweaked. So overall, character animation feels faithful to the prior game, with just a few minor changes here and there. The basic locomotion still feels a little bit off to me, but overall it works. Perhaps it's also worth discussing the scenery itself. Monster Hunter World presents relatively complex areas with a lot of moving, animated foliage placed all over the place that also reacts to the player. So how does it fare on Switch? Well, the foliage is animated, and it does react to your character, but it also feels less dramatic somehow. Why is that? Well, this mainly comes down to shadow rendering. terrain foliage is properly shadowed in Monster Hunter World, but this is reduced or missing on Switch, giving the impression of reduced scene depth. Furthermore, the shadows that are included, such as tree shadows, are completely static in Monster Hunter Rise, while they're animated in Monster Hunter World. Water rendering also differs. Both games utilize screen space reflections, but the water surface shader and distortion below vary significantly. World even takes into account shadows penetrating the water surface. They appear sharper and defined across the surface itself, but the secondary shadows are more diffuse below the surface. This is absent on Switch. One other conceit likely made to save on CPU time is distant animation. Essentially, when enemies are a certain distance from the camera, their animation rate is halved, so they only update at essentially 15 frames per second instead of 30. It's extremely noticeable with flying creatures such as this. They appear choppy from a distance, but up close, they move at full rate. But okay, at this point, you're probably wondering, why are you pointing out all these flaws? Well, that's the thing. I don't really think these are flaws. It simply demonstrates what the developers had to consider when adapting features from a more demanding game to a less powerful platform such as the Switch. From what I can tell, the goal here was to build a game that retains the sense of scale and open design as seen in Monster Hunter World, but on the Nintendo Switch. In that sense, Capcom's designers have been successful, I feel. The cuts they've made all make sense to me and certainly do not distract from the game in any significant way. It's still a handsome looking game overall. Between this and Ghosts and Goblins Resurrection, the RE engine has made a strong debut on Switch and seems to be quite scalable. Of course, the other part of this discussion comes down to performance, and this is one area where Monster Hunter World was frustrating. It's now buttery smooth on the latest consoles, but if you played on the original platforms, the frame rate was always unlocked and somewhat unsteady. I had hoped for a 30 frames per second cap, but that option never arrived. Even the prior 3DS games featured an unlocked unsteady frame rate, so I was a little worried that this might follow with the new Switch title. Thankfully, Capcom has made the right decision here, at least in my book. The frame rate is capped at a maximum of 30 frames per second. Now, of course, an option to uncap the frame rate would be nice, specifically for any potential future iterations of the Switch hardware, but for playing it on the Switch as we have now, this is the right choice. Now, while capturing for this video, I played around within the first two hunting areas. Based on the gameplay during these sections, I can safely say that the target frame rate of 30 frames per second is reached and sustained most of the time. But it's not flawless. During certain moments, I noticed both minor dips in performance, as well as occasional bouts of incorrect frame pacing. These issues are visible if you watch the frame time graph, and basically interrupt fluidity, just for a moment though. I would say that it's uncommon enough that it won't be an issue for most players, but those of you who are sensitive to frame rate fluctuations will likely notice it. If we switch over to portable mode then, it's basically the same story, a stable 30 frames per second with occasional interruptions to fluidity. It's certainly the best Monster Hunter has ever looked or run on a portable system, that's for sure. The only caveat to all of this is that in the pre-release state, I was not able to join any multiplayer games, which means I couldn't really test the game with multiple hunters running around. Now, I'd imagine this won't be a huge issue, as there's no evidence to suggest that additional characters will impact frame rate in any significant fashion, but we're gonna have to wait and see. Once the game goes live, I'll try to test this feature, and I might discuss it on the DF Direct Weekly show, so keep an eye out for that if you're curious. Now, the other aspect of performance is of course loading, and thankfully this is also acceptable. Loading screens occur primarily when leaving or returning to the village, and they're mercifully quick. Once you arrive within the desired map though, even fast traveling back to the camp is instant. Another aspect I'd like to discuss then is sound. Firstly, surround sound support is not a given when it comes to Switch games. Some titles leave this out, only offering stereo, but thankfully Capcom has delivered here, and Monster Hunter Rise does support proper 5.1 audio output. This is key in establishing the mood, I feel, as the game relies heavily on ambient sound, whether it's the chirping of insects in the trees or the sound of a distant waterfall. It all sounds remarkably good. Beyond this, the soundtrack is rather memorable. The title track, for instance, is a beautiful vocal piece. But the in-game battle music is also suitably epic. It's good stuff, right? Beyond this, the game also offers a packed options menu with lots of adjustable settings, as is common for the Monster Hunter series. Crucially, gyro aiming is also an option. It's not my preferred method of play, mind you, but I know a lot of Switch fans adore this feature. You can even adjust sensitivity for both docked and portable modes separately. Okay then, so overall I feel that Capcom has done a commendable job in building this latest installment. It demonstrates that RE Engine has potential on Switch. The right cuts were made while still delivering a beautiful looking experience, at least mostly. Certain sections can appear somewhat plain at times, but the overall aesthetic is nice. It's fair to say if you've ever enjoyed a Monster Hunter game, it's definitely worth giving this one a look. But that's gonna do it for this video. If you enjoyed it, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, and follow us over on Twitter. And until next time, this is John signing off.